Hey guys, this is Jay Calderon with 12rounder.com and bringing you this week's edition of 12-Rounder Radio. Just real quickly here, of course, you can check out all the quick results and the results in full for that matter at the website 12rounder.com. Links in the description. You can click the quick results link, of course. You can check out David Lemieux's big win and, of course, also Tomas Delorme picking up a win over Hank Lundy. Picked both of those, but, we don't need to get into that. I mean, it's not a big deal. I'm pretty good at it. We don't need to get into all that, though. I'm just saying I'm pretty good. But let's not dwell on it. In any event, let's talk about this upcoming weekend's fight. That's pretty much what we're going to be covering here. First things first, let's get into Amir Khan versus Devin Alexander. What struck me most interesting about this fight, of course, is that both guys need it. It's one of those things where neither can afford a slip-up. They've had a couple of losses. Now, the good news, so to speak, for both fighters is that they've lost against the best fighters. For the most part. Again, Amir Khan had the Brady Prescott slip up, but that being said, he's probably redeemed himself with the Luis Collazo win, with the Marcos Maidana win, with the war against Lamont Peterson. For the most part, people understand, yes, he does have a questionable chin from time to time, but for the most part, he's at least going to give you a couple of rounds where, at the very least, he's at a pretty high level. An interesting fact about Amir Khan, other than the Brady Prescott fight, he's never been in a fight where after 3 or 4 rounds, at least 2 or 3 rounds, maybe in the Danny Garcia case, that he's been behind. He's never had to come from behind. And what's most interesting about the Alexander-Khan fight to me is that Alexander's a good enough boxer with a good punch, but light enough punches, that if Khan comes in a little sluggish, perhaps a little reckless, perhaps he's not as sharp as he needs to be, or whatever the case may be, it could be a fight where Khan actually does have to come from behind to a certain extent. And that's an interesting position to put Khan, because for all intents and purposes, I don't know if I remember a fight that I've seen him in where he had to come from behind. Certainly not since he's reached the top level. You could make an interesting argument that the Paul McCloskey fight, he actually did have some questionable moments early, but that was an awkward, weird fight. And depending on how you wanted to judge that fight, it was sort of okay, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But for all intents and purposes, he's always been in command, even when he's been stopped, or when he's been hurt and had some problems late. The fact of the matter is, he's always been ahead early in a fight. And again, this fight could be a different sort of animal, and a perhaps interesting look at the sort of fighting spirit Khan has from that position. When it comes to his heart overall, the guy is a fighter. He wants to get up. He's gotten up every time. He wants to continue. But it's a different sort of fighter you have to be in order to try to come from behind and still actually give yourself a good chance. Not just any chance, but a good chance. And Khan, a talented enough fighter, he always has a good chance if he puts himself out there. The question is, will he? I think he will, but it's interesting nonetheless to try and watch that fight. And same sort of, in a weird way, it reminds me of the Matt Korobov versus Andy Lee middleweight fight that's going to be taking place over the weekend as well. A couple of these fights that I'm going to be mentioning, of course, are going to be on separate cards. There's the Amir Khan versus Devin Alexander fights that are going to be taking place at the MGM Grand, whereas there's also the Cosmopolitan fights that are going to be taking place on the Tim Bradley Chavez card, Diego Chavez card. That's going to be taking place also in Vegas, and that features the Korobov Lee fight that I'm about to get into here. That fight's a very interesting fight to me because, in a certain sense, much like Khan and Alexander, it's one of those fights where both guys need it, but in this case, it's for a different reason. The reason there is Khan and Devin Alexander are A fighters, meaning they're the sort of fighters that 9 out of 10 times, 99 out of 100 times perhaps even, you expect them to win their fight. That being said, they do have their flaws. They have been beaten in fights, and they're not going to be favored against anyone. Or everyone, I should say. With Lee and Korobov, they're the sort of fighters that seem on the surface to be good enough to reach that level at times. Yet in the case of Korobov, because of perhaps his handling or just development or whatever the case may be, he hasn't reached that chance just yet, until now. And Lee, on the other hand, has had his shots, but has come up just short on most occasions. Against Chavez, most notably. Against Brian Vera, the first time, yeah, he lost, but he came back, avenged it. So he's had moments, but not that moment. And against one another, they will look for that moment for themselves. And that's always an interesting fight. It's literally that sort of legitimate, the epitome of a crossroads fight. And I always love those sort of fights. Whether or not this is going to be a great fight is sort of, semi-debatable. Style-wise, you don't know what Korobov brings to the table until you see him in there against a guy who's had a few fights under his belt, who some good fights under his belt, who's battle-tested, who, while he's had some chinny incidents in the past, has nonetheless come back and has always fought and always has a legitimate puncher's chance because he can certainly bang, can Andy Lee. And it's, you don't know what Lee's going to show up. Is it going to be the composed boxer puncher, or is it going to be the guy that's going in there for the kill? It's one of those things where, it's an interesting one. And you're going to find out if Lee ever had it, or if Korobov will ever have it. And it's one of those things where, it's one of those fights, like I was saying, that it's very interesting at the very least on paper, how it maps out and what style either fighter is able to bring to the ring or decides to bring to the ring's a whole different issue, but I'm certainly looking forward to that fight. Another fight I'm looking forward to is actually the main event on that card, Bradley versus Chavez. As I mentioned before, that fight's going to be taking place at the Cosmopolitan of Las Vegas. Very interesting fight in the sense that it's one of those fights where Bradley should win an award, in a certain sense, for fighting guys that... There are a lot of fighters where Bradley's in this sort of position where he's not an A guy that can just sell a pay-per-view by himself. But a lot of guys who are as talented as him and to hardcore fans are as known as he is, that are in his sort of position, would want those sort of fights and would fight nobodies, bums, nothings, just biding time until hopefully that sort of big fight came around. Bradley is not that guy. Bradley's sort of stay-busy fights, if you will, have been the sort of fights that most guys would avoid like the plague, hoping for that big money fight with Pacquiao or Mayweather or whoever the case may be. Bradley's stay-busy fights are Ruslan Provodnikov, are Luis Abregu, who was a decent undefeated fighter at the time and proved his worth against Tomas Delorme later on. Bradley's stay-busy fights are against Diego Chavez, a legit puncher who's only lost to the best of the best and can box and bang a little bit, certainly can bang. And again, I'm not saying these are actual stay-busy fights as we currently know them, but that's the sort of fight where it's like, okay, this isn't the biggest fight of the year. I mean, it's such a normal-ish fight, so to speak, that it's happening on the same day that a fight just across town, if you will, is also taking place between Khan and Alexander. So it's certainly not one of those fights where other promoters are like, oh, we better reschedule our dates because I don't think this is going to... Like, no, it's a fairly basic fight in a sense, in that it's just two guys, known, have some skills, have some assets, let's see who wins. That's pretty much it. Bradley's expected to win. Chavez is a legit and fair underdog, but it's an interesting enough fight. And it's one of those fights where Bradley doesn't have to take this fight. In a sense, he kind of does, probably asking for the sort of money that I'm sure he and his team are asking for, and to stay relevant, coming off of, in many people's eyes, the second loss to Pacquiao. It's one of those fights where, okay, yeah, fair enough, Bradley probably does need some sort of pulse opposite him in the ring on the night, but there are different ways matchmakers try to make those sort of guys like, see, he had a pulse because 2 fights ago he gave someone a tougher than expected fight, and all of a sudden it seems like it's an interesting fight, but in reality it's kind of just, it's a fight. That fighter should win, the A fighter. Bradley, on the other hand, is in there with a guy who, it's not the most unimaginable thing that he pulls off the upset. I don't expect it to happen, but it could. And I've always liked Bradley for that. Since he went over to England and fought Junior Witter, I've always liked the sort of tenacity of Bradley. A guy willing to be like, you know what? I'm in this to fight. That's what I do. I like to fight people. If this is the guy that I need to fight to get to that next level, to get to that, take that next step, so be it. I'm fine with that. I like that in Bradley. Definitely like that in Bradley. And it's interesting because of the headbutt thing, or because of the fact that the judges decided to give him a fight that maybe he didn't deserve, Bradley gets a bad rap from a lot of people. You know, he's not the fastest hands in the world. He's not the hardest punching guy in the world. Not the hardest puncher in the world, let's put it. But the fact is, he's a guy ready and willing. And you've seen that time and time again, and it's an interesting fight for that alone to me. Just the fact that deep down, if they really wanted to, they could give you a different sort of fight for Bradley. But they're actually giving you an actual fight. And gotta say, kudos, because it doesn't need to happen. But I'm pretty happy it is, because it could be a pretty interesting fight. Final thing I want to touch on here this week, Abner Mares and Victor Ortiz. Sort of in the same kind of fights here. Of course, Mares will be taking on Jose Ramirez. You might remember him as the guy who was first blitzed by Vasily Lomachenko in his first official professional fight. And Ortiz will be taking on Mike Perez. Certainly a decent fighter in his own right. That being said, both Mares and Ortiz are expected to win. The fact of the matter is, both are in a weird spot, though. They're not in the same sort of fights where, look, Mares is probably the more respected fighter out of the two, in the sense that he seems like a fighter. His reputation got a bit tarnished when he sort of seemed to shy away from that Johnny Gonzalez fight, but for the most part, people respect Mares as a legit, genuine fighter. Ortiz, on the other end, he's acting, he sort of seems to suggest he doesn't need to take this sort of fight after his loss to Marcos Maidana. Then he's coming back, he's talking a lot, he's bragging a lot, and he has the weird incident with Floyd Mayweather. Then he continues to brag and such. Then he gets knocked out in a couple rounds by a non-puncher in Luis Collazo. It's a weird situation. It's a weird time for Victor Ortiz. But it's also, and this is how these two situations sort of parallel themselves, it is also sort of an interesting time in Abner Mares' career. You know, he switched he switched trainers very recently. He's in a situation where he might be a bit unsure of himself. You know, that was a big left hook he got caught with, but that being said, it seemed to alter things in Mares' mind. He didn't seem to want to go out there and just be gung-ho with everyone. He kind of seemed to be a guy that wanted to, let's reevaluate a few things here. And ultimately, no matter how you look at it, that's kind of where both of those guys are. They have to sort of evaluate themselves and be honest with themselves. Now, of course, athletes are some of the most dishonest people on the planet, because they have to be. You have to be the best in your mind, even when deep down you have to be smart enough to know you're not. That's just the way it is. You have to train as hard as possible. You have to trick yourself into getting up and training in certain cases, because you don't want to do it every single day. I mean, you have to. Part of the job, in a certain sense, is to lie to yourself. Because if you were going to be honest and say, you know what? You know, we have no chance against this team. We'll go through the motions, but at the end of the day, we're going to lose to this team. So let's just prepare for the next game where we have a shot at it. Everything is thrown off. Your rhythm, your pace, your timing, your morale, everything is thrown off. You have to feel that you have a shot against that team. Otherwise, why are you playing? Why would you do it? If you're similarly as a fighter, maybe it's not, you take fights you expect to win in that sense, unless it's a huge payday, and then you're just looking for the payday. But for the most part, you take fights expecting to win. So you don't necessarily lie to yourself about whether or not you can win or lose, but you lie to yourself about whether or not you're training to the absolute best of the sport's ability. Are you the best trained fighter in the world? Maybe not. Are you in the best shape of your life? Maybe not. Did you run every single step and mile that you possibly could? Maybe not. But you have to convince yourself that you're doing enough, or you're going to drive yourself up the wall. Maybe you could have put in an extra session, and maybe it wouldn't have overtrained you. But if you're going to continue to think that way, you're gonna go, and I hate to use such a cornball expression here, but you're going to go crazy. You're going to go bananas. I said it. There. Judge me. The fact of the matter is, it's one of these situations where, well, that's acceptable, and it's sort of an unspoken rule of just not even a rule, just an unspoken truth of the sport. The fact of the matter is, this is a moment in both of their careers where they have to be honest with themselves and try to assess themselves and try to figure out what they're going to be. Now, I don't know if these sort of fights, or these fights in particular, are going to be the fights where you are able to find that out about yourself. I certainly don't think Mares is going to find that out against Jose Ramirez. I expect him to win. He should stop him, I think. And I would expect that Ortiz beats Mike Perez. I think he should beat Mike Perez. That being said, you find out a bit about every fighter in every single fight, I suppose, for the most part. And I think the interesting part about these two fights, if there is anything at all, I mean, at the end of the day, it's just sort of a fight to see some named fighters get a win, is really what you're expecting to see here. But if there is anything to learn, it's in this fight, it's how they handle now, at this phase in their career, how they handle the sort of fights they should win. Because if they look like anything at any point in time during these fights, if they look anything less than fighters that should win this fight, it's a very worrying time in both careers. And, it's not to add any extra pressure or anything like that, but the fact of the matter is they should win these fights. But now they're in a point in their career where you question some things that they might or might not be able to do, just because of, recent events, and especially in Ortiz's case. Nonetheless, if you're looking for a reason to be interested in those fights, I tried to help you out there. There you go. Anyway, as I was mentioning, these are the sort of fights coming up this week, and I felt like delving into the fights. We're rounding out the year here, and a couple of interesting fights going on, a couple of pretty sizable, interesting cards taking place, so I figured I'd give that a bit of a talking about. And again, schedule coming up for this weekend, you got at the MGM Grand, you have Amir Khan taking on Devin Alexander, Keith Thurman will be taking on Leonard Bundu in a battle of unbeatens, you have the Abner Maris versus Jose Ramirez fight, and of course you have Victor Ortiz taking on Mike Perez. Then again, effectively across the street, you have Timothy Bradley taking on Diego Chavez. You also have Mauricio Herrera taking on Jose Benavidez in what is sure to be a Fight of the Year candidate. And you also have, for the portion of the vacant middleweight title here, you have Matt Korobov taking on Andy Lee. So, tell me what your thoughts on these fights are. Of course, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments below, and of course on Twitter at 12RounderBoxing. Who do you think's going to win? What do you think it might mean? Picking any upsets? Tell me everything and all. I'd love to hear it. Of course, like I said, on Twitter and in the comments below. Be sure to follow, be sure to subscribe, share, like, all that sort of stuff. Love to hear from you. And until next time, enjoy the fights.